Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad you are all joining me today. It is just after dark in Brooklyn, New York. I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. So much to discuss. You know, it's interesting. In summertime, I feel like I wake up at night. Summertime during the day, you're kind of like, it's hot, right? You just kind of want to be calm. But then, as the sun goes down, and that sun is not beating on you any longer, right? All of a sudden, you awaken. You have your energy back, right? It's the opposite of what you want. You want to have energy during the day, you want to sleep at night. But instead, you're tired all day, and then at night, you awaken. At least that's how my body seems to be during the summertime. So it is now almost sundown. I'm looking out my window, and I can see that the sun is just setting. So glad you all are joining us. Shout out to Tim. Shout out to Owen Stevens. Shout out to Steve-O Awesome. Shout out to Martin. Shout out to Namandi. Yes, so much that we can talk about. Shout out to Lisa Hauserman. Saw your comment earlier. Shout out to EV. Glad you all are joining us. So much to discuss here on this lovely YouTube Live. Now is that time, by the way. Shout out to Libertas. Now is the time to take the link and cut and paste it and put it on your Twitter. Say, Caleb is talking. Felicity, shout out to you. Now is the time to cut and paste the link and put it on your Facebook. Say, oh my gosh, Caleb is live. Let's get him to talk about blank. Get all your friends to join me and urge me to talk about the topic you want to talk about, because the more the merrier, right? So much to discuss on this lovely day. So now is the time to make it a bigger conversation. Tweet this out, spread the word, make this a bigger conversation. I have so much on my mind that I want to talk about. Like I said, in summertime, in the peak of summer, shout out to pasta. In the peak of summertime, I always like well, it's not that I like, but it seems like I wake up as soon as the lights go down, as soon as the sun is setting. So you all are here to join me. I've got a full evening ahead of me. I had an interesting day today, and I will tell you about what went on today in New York City. I will get to that, but plenty of other things to discuss. So I'm going to pour the beverage that will not be named. I know you all have figured out what it is, but I'm going to pretend, for theatrical purposes, that you all do not know what my beverage of choice is, because I do not want to give advertising to a ruthless corporation. But I am pouring the beverage. What a day, folks. So much to discuss. So much to discuss. You know, there was an incident in which a Russian ship and a U.S. Navy ship got pretty close. And we have to realize there's a faction within our government in the United States that seems determined to have some kind of confrontation with Russia. I don't know what it's about. I don't know why, but they are determined. They are just determined to have some kind of confrontation with Russia, and it's very frightening. It's certainly frightening. And those of us with common sense, we obviously don't want that. So there you go. But what else is on people's minds? I've got a lot that I can discuss. I've got my top button here. I'm relaxing now, folks. I just unbuttoned the top button. That's because I'm relaxing. So much that we can discuss. Now, I don't know if folks saw, like I told you, I always go through the weekend Wall Street Journal, right? I always go through the weekend Wall Street Journal. Because they have more articles that are kind of summarizing trends. It's not news as it happens. And I noticed some very interesting things. Now, you'll notice that the cover here is from the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, where the president of Russia and the president of China just had a meeting. And I'm going to talk about that. But there's quite a bit. And, I mean, we're not just talking about in the front section, but also in the exchange section, about Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley. So, as you can see, up top here, we've got Democrats rake in tech donations. The beginning of the article reads, "No other candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination has been as eager to call for the breakup of Google as Senator Elizabeth Warren. Yet employees at Google and its parent company, Alphabet Incorporated, so far have made up the largest source of high-dollar donations to the Massachusetts senator's campaign." And then you go just further down on the page. Google, others now draw state scrutiny. State attorneys general are preparing for their own investigations into big tech platforms, including Google and Facebook, based on concerns that largely mirror those probes by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. This is adding to the regulatory headaches for the tech giants and potentially adding to the pressure on federal officials. So right now, the tech monopolies of Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, there is talk at this point of invoking antitrust legislation against them, right? And arguing that they have monopolies that are illegitimate and that the government should be breaking them up. And it seems that these efforts are coming from the Trump White House. And it should be no secret to anybody that Silicon Valley favors the Democratic Party. They do, right? If you look at what's going on at this point, Silicon Valley don't care much for Donald Trump. They tend to favor the Democrats. They're donating in big numbers to the Democrats. However, Democrats are also calling for them to be more scrutinized and broken up. And I think this points to the fact, which I don't think folks would disagree with, I think it points to the fact that if you're going to be regulated, you would rather be regulated by your friend than regulated by your enemy, right? Because at this point, Google, Facebook, they're going to face some regulation. They would rather be regulated by Elizabeth Warren than by Donald Trump. And if you look at it, folks, I am not in favor of censorship. And let me repeat, I am not in favor of censorship, right? I don't think that they should be banning people from YouTube or Twitter for their political opinion. I am not in favor of censorship because I know who that censorship is ultimately coming from and who it ultimately serves. I am not in favor of tech censorship. I'm not at all. I am not in favor of it at all. However, a lot of the people who have been targeted by it are not people I particularly care for. For example, PragerU has been complaining that they have faced some censorship. Well, PragerU is awful, and I have refuted a lot of their videos. If you follow my Twitter feed, you'll know how much I can't stand PragerU and the deceptions about politics that they constantly invoke. I mean, they have a video, for goodness sakes, where they say that if you can't have a cell phone if you don't like capitalism, because capitalism made the cell phone, when, lo and behold, there I said it. I said the phrase I was going to try not to say. But the first cell phone was invented in 1952 in the Soviet Union. So PragerU is just lying, right? This notion that cell phones prove how great capitalism is just wrong on a number of levels. So I can't stand PragerU. I really can't. And their video about Karl Marx is ridiculously inaccurate. I mean, it says things that are just, it's one thing to lie about the history of the Soviet Union and stuff, but they've gone as far in their video as saying that the book Capital, Karl Marx's magnum opus, Capital, right? The book he spent years in the British Museum doing the research for, that it has no statistical data in it. They actually say that. There was no data in the book Capital. And anybody can get a copy of Capital. I think I got my copy around here somewhere. Well, I got it somewhere. But anyway, anyone can open Capital by Karl Marx and see that it is loaded with data. I mean, that book is, the amount of industrial research and industrial statistics in that book is not small at all. And on some level, it's the same with Dinesh D'Souza, PragerU. They hate their audience. They really do. They kind of see their audience, I think. I'm just looking into them here. I can't tell you exactly, but, I don't read minds. But it seems to me that they hate their audience. I love you guys, right? And I do my best to be upfront with you guys. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than it would be convenient to say, right? It'd be easy to simplify things, But I try to do my best to always give you, the facts as they are, right? Because I want you to understand the world as it exists. But if you listen to Dinesh D'Souza, when he says things to the effect of, Martin Luther King was a conservative, or Martin Luther King was a right-winger like me, and then, shortly afterwards he says things to the effect of, oh, Martin Luther King proves how evil the left is, when you listen to PragerU say things like the book Capital has no data in it, I don't think the people making those videos are that stupid. I really don't. And I think on some level they don't respect their audience. They kind of view their audience as stupid suckers. What can we say that our audience will like, and then they'll share us, right? What can we say, and who cares if it's true? How stupid is our audience? What can we get away with saying to our audience? That's basically what they do. And I don't particularly respect that, honestly. And I don't like PragerU, but at the same time, should they be censored? No. Should they be, silenced? No. Should the tech monopolies beat them down and punish them for their views? No, I don't think so. And so I am not in favor of censorship at all. But it's pretty clear that the censorship right now, at this moment, seems to be leaning mostly against the Trump faction, right? It seems that the Trump faction has been targeted by Silicon Valley censorship at this point. And if you look into where Silicon Valley came from, and it's worth noting this, it's not a secret anymore. At one point, if you'd have said this, people would have looked at you like, oh, God, you got a tinfoil hat on your head. But at this point, it's not disputed that Silicon Valley was created as a result of a tactical and strategic decision by the central intelligence agencies. Google that. Google it, right? We're talking about tech monopolies, but no, I mean, if you can look it up, for example, there were loans provided. There were big efforts to make Southern California the center of the global computer revolution. And that was a decision that came from government officials, not from the private sector. And it was largely rooted in the fact that there was a treaty. There was a treaty that didn't allow the Soviet Union to get any computer technology. On the basis that computer technology could potentially have military use, all the NATO countries had a treaty that they could not, they wouldn't. It was illegal for any NATO country to share computer technology with the Soviets. So the Soviet Union was forced to develop computers on their own. And they actually did some amazing, feats, despite not having anywhere near the level of development, not having anywhere near the budget. In the Soviet Union, in the 80s, they had their own home computer system that they developed, all on their own. It was not compatible with Western technology. It wasn't copied from Western technology. Electronica something, I believe it was called. The Soviet Union did a lot in terms of computer technology, but they couldn't acquire any breakthroughs that came from the West. So the CIA made a strategic decision to fund like crazy, pour government money into the computer revolution. That's why Al Gore, right? He famously said, I invented the internet, and everyone laughed at him like, what an egotistical maniac. Well, what he was referring to was the fact that he and the Democrats and the CIA and the intelligence agencies made a strategic decision to pour lots of U.S. government funds into the computer revolution. And it was successful, right? And the USA, being the center of the Western capitalist global economy, had the ability to invest way more, and they also had the ability to, blockade the Soviet Union and make sure they couldn't get any of these breakthroughs. And the fact that the West was at the center of the computer revolution had a lot to do with the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was one factor. It was a very big factor. That ultimately is something that can't be forgotten. And the relationship between Silicon Valley and the intelligence agencies is long-standing, right? And, we saw that during the Arab Spring. There was an individual who worked, in Hillary Clinton's State Department, who was also a board member of Alphabet Google. And during the Arab Spring, they walked hand in hand. And they worked with Twitter, and they coordinated social media activities, and they brag about this. In Hillary Clinton's State Department, not only did you have Hillary Clinton, you had Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was kind of the intellectual driving it. And you read her essays, she's calling for a permanent global revolution to spread capitalism all over the world and overthrow any quote-unquote populist regime that would challenge Wall Street's power. Anne-Marie Slaughter, she doesn't care if there's mass slaughter in order to serve the open international system, as she calls it. I mean, she spells it all out there. Anne-Marie Slaughter, she knows what she's doing. There was another individual there who was on the board, and the board of Google Alphabet, and it was all about using social media in order to destabilize countries that get in the way of Wall Street. And they spell this out. I mean, it's very, very, very blatant. Very, very blatant. And, those relationships are long-standing. But there has been, as I'm sure folks are aware, there has been a long-standing divide among the American elite between the intelligence agencies on the one side and the Pentagon on the other. They have different interests. The Pentagon, the weapons manufacturers, it's all about peace through strength. It's all about, making the United States very, very powerful, selling lots of weapons, looking super powerful and threatening, and it doesn't really matter if the rest of the world likes us. And, and we can fight big wars and make lots of money doing so. That's the Pentagon's worldview, peace through strength. Whereas the intelligence agencies, their attitude is more like, let's make the USA look like Mr. Nice Guy. Let's find proxy forces and manipulate them. And essentially, let's assert U.S. power, undermine opponents of the USA on the global stage subtly. I've often joked that the CIA are kind of like producers, right? If you work in TV production, which I have and do, the producer, they don't write the script. The producer, they don't film anything. The producer, they all they do is make things happen, right? All the producer does is make things happen, right? They find someone to film it. They find someone to write it. They find people and they put them to work, and they kind of just make things happen. And it's widely understood among those who work in TV production that if a producer does their job well, no one knows they exist. And if things go wrong, everyone blames the producer. And that's basically how the intelligence agencies of the United States strive to work. They want no one to know they exist. You're supposed to think that the people of Ukraine just want to be part of the European Union. It was just a spontaneous uprising. You're supposed to think that the people of Syria just want their freedom from evil Assad. You're supposed to think the people of Venezuela just can't stand Maduro anymore, right? And the USA is supposed to just has nothing to do with it. It's just sitting back and watching as the people of Venezuela fight for their freedom. And that's how the CIA operates. That's how the intel agencies operate. However, the Pentagon, it's all about shock and awe. Boom, bam, we're powerful, we're number one, peace through superior firepower, right? That's the Pentagon worldview, and that those worldviews clash. The liberals, historically, have been closer to the CIA, especially like the Kennedy administration, right? Those who make violent revolution impossible, those who make violent revolution I'm going to get it right here. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. That's Kennedy. Well, the reason Kennedy said that was basically, look, if we can be Mr. Nice Guy around the world, we can set up a Peace Corps, we can force some of the U.S.-aligned regimes to loosen things up and let them build some infrastructure, we can subtly defeat the communists. Whereas the Pentagon was saying, nope, all in, peace through strength, all in Vietnam, and that was a difference, right? And a lot of people speculate that had a lot to do with Kennedy's death, that his favoring of soft power tactics had a lot to do with him being undermined, because at that point, especially coming out of the Second World War, but even still to this day, we have an economy that's centered around a military-industrial complex. And that military-industrial complex doesn't make money through soft power operations. And in fact, soft power operations are very expensive. It involves a lot of U.S. money going and being given to proxy forces, right? Not a lot of spending and making money through military contractors, but the opposite. And that's something that has to be acknowledged. And you can see that division. And Silicon Valley, a result of CIA strategy, Silicon Valley emerging really in the late 80s to its position, and then ultimately in the 90s, you have the rise of the internet. Silicon Valley, they very much are in with the CIA, whereas it seems like Trump is doubling down for the Pentagon at this point. I mean, he's blatant about it. When he says that the Saudis, it doesn't matter. Okay, maybe they did kill this journalist who didn't deserve to die, but hey, at least we're making lots of money selling weapons, and we don't want the Russians to do it. When Trump is yelling at Turkey and telling Turkey that their purchases of airline systems and their purchase of S-400 missiles is unacceptable from Russia, and they should be buying these weapons from the United States. Who says? Doesn't Turkey have the right to decide who it buys its weapons from? But no, Turkey will buy its weapons from us. He's working. Trump seems to be very, very close to the military and industrial complex. Those weapons manufacturers and Trump are like this. Whereas the CIA, the New Yorker magazine referred to Trump's speech to the CIA as a blatant disrespect. And Trump's relationship with the intel agencies is not very good. So there seems to be a bit of a division there. And the intel agencies seem to be backing the Democrats, and that seems to lead to Silicon Valley backing the Democrats. Whereas Trump seems to be in with the Pentagon, and that leads to Silicon Valley not being too friendly to Trump. However, Jeff Bezos is a creature of Silicon Valley, if ever, right? Amazon.com. Do you think that would have happened without the computer revolution? You think that, the fact that Jeff Bezos was able to get a monopoly, virtual monopoly on book sales online, it's like he has no one who comes near him, right? He is the top of the internet sales business. Do you think that he just got that way accidentally? I don't think so. I think he had connections in the computer revolution world. Well, Jeff Bezos, Silicon Valley, those folks tend to be tied in with the intelligence agencies. And let me add that the intelligence agencies seem to be very tied in with big oil and big banks. And that's an angle too, right? So what is the CIA's brain, right? We all talk about the CIA. What is the CIA's brain? It's called the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. Biggest foreign policy think tank in the United States. Huge. Look at its funders. The Rockefellers, the Ford Foundation, right? It's the ultra-rich, folks who are tied in with ExxonMobil and JP Morgan, and it is big banks and big oil companies that very much, that's the Council on Foreign Relations. That's one faction, right? And the Rockefeller family, they've also got the Asia Society, that's the Rockefellers as well. The Asia Society is one of the main think tanks that the United States strategizes its efforts in Asia. You talk about the American Enterprise Institute, which is one of the key neocon areas, right? I think John Bolton comes out of there. This is all big oil companies. So you got big oil companies, you got the CIA, and you got Silicon Valley on the one side. And then you've got the Pentagon, and you've got weapons manufacturers on the other side. It's a divide. I've often talked about the fight between the rich and the ultra-rich, and how in a lot of ways Trump represents the rich against the ultra-rich. The ultra-rich, very small number, but huge amounts of wealth. Rockefeller, Carnegie, DuPont, Morgan, right? Those folks have huge amounts of wealth. Whereas there are a lot of millionaires and billionaires in the United States who are not in the club. Betsy DeVos is not in the club. Her wealth comes from Amway, from Tupperware parties, right? She is not in the same club as Rockefellers and the Morgans. And that divide, where we see kind of the lower levels of American capital, those millionaires and billionaires who aren't entrenched monopolists, who aren't in with Wall Street's big banks, that they seem to be fighting and pushing back against the forces that seem to have so much power in our global economy. And this is a fight between the rich and ultra-rich, Trump aligning with the rich. I've often given the example of Trump's federal prison regulations, right? We saw that Trump recently, took some very dramatic reforms in federal prison sentencing, changed a lot of conditions, actually brought a woman who was in federal prison to his State of the Union address. And why do you think Trump reformed the way the federal prison system's going? Well, I can't read minds, but I'll tell you one thing. Have you noticed that every millionaire or billionaire who's ever been locked up in the federal prison system seems to be supporting Trump? Yeah, because the rich can buy their way out of it, right? Trump represents that low-level Wall Street guy who gets busted for insider trading. Trump represents that hotel owner who feels like he's getting kicked around. Trump represents the person who owns a big chain of stores and feels like Amazon and Jeff Bezos are putting them out of business and that the post office is working with them too closely, right? Trump represents the lower levels of American capital rising up against the entrenched circles of wealth, the ruling families, the oligarchy that's very in with the intelligence agencies and the foreign policy circles in Silicon Valley. And that divide seems to be very, very big. And that seems to be what's happening. And I think you can interpret this Silicon Valley stuff, this Democratic Party calling to regulate Silicon Valley while they get money from Silicon Valley. Why? Because, Silicon Valley wants to make sure the people who regulate them are doing it right. That's what you can interpret this as. And it's funny because one thing I will say, when it comes to the folks on the lower level of American capital, like PragerU, for example, right? PragerU, they ain't part of the club, right? They're not allowed to advertise on Spotify. They're considered to be racist. Their YouTube videos get messed with, and, they're always complaining about mistreatment. But yet, they are against net neutrality. Why? Well, free market. It's free market, right? Free market. The lower levels of the rich, they believe in the free market ideology so much. They really do. They believe in the free market ideology so much. Capitalism is great. Look, I got rich, right? They're the nouveau riche, the new money. They believe in this free market stuff, even though it's being used against them, for goodness sakes. I saw that Brandon REA sent me a $1 super chat. Well, thank you, Brandon. I appreciate it. And I see you all in the chat there. I saw a lot of extensive discussion about my beverage of choice. I don't have much to say about that. But I do, want to respond to you all. I do want to say things that will be responding to what you all say. I've got plenty of my own material. But I see you all there in the chat, and please tell me what's on your mind. Tell me what you want to talk about. If I don't say it now, I can write it down in my lovely notebook here and come back to it later. But Brandon Array is saying, did you hear about Steven Crowder and Vox? And I did not. I did not hear about it. So there you go. There you go. Now, Owen is asking me to talk about Pelosi and the Tiananmen Memorial. Jacob James is saying, hey, enjoyed your talk in New York at the burger spot. Love this discussion. Well, thank you, Jacob. Oh, we did. We did have a good burger a few months back. That was fun. Yes, I'm having a great time here. Xi Jinping met Putin, and that I am going to be talking about. That is on my list of things to talk about. We just saw the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in Russia. A lot to talk about there, and that gets to the thesis, a central point of my upcoming book that will be coming out. Wow, I'm just getting super chats from everybody now. Old Gringo sends me a super chat. Well, hey, folks, I appreciate it. But we're having a great time here. Make this a bigger discussion, bring more people in. We're having a great time. And hey, plenty that we can discuss. She gave Putin 2 panda bears. Well, I wasn't going to talk about that, but that is true. I did notice that. That was in the news that President Xi did give Putin some panda bears for the Russian zoos. And that'll be a good thing, right? I think it's good that they have, panda bears in their zoos in Russia. I remember when I was a kid, I would go to the zoo. I went to the Cleveland Zoo. That was 2 hours or so from where I grew up, and they had panda bears, and I liked them. I thought that was cool. I also liked the other animals at the zoo. I think a zoo is kind of a little kid thing. After you get to a certain age, you're just kind of like, okay, there's animals. I get it. But when you're a small child, being someplace and looking at a giraffe from the other side of a fence is very, very exciting. And hey, there you go. I'm all for it. But the other thing I wanted to mention is there has been a hiring slowdown. Did folks hear about hiring slowdown? The hiring slowdown. So there's been a hiring slowdown. What does that mean? Well, I will give you the data. All right? Don't take it from me. Take it from the horse's mouth. Pace of hiring slows across economy. The economy added 75,000 jobs in May, marking the 104th straight month of gains, but also, quote, one of the weakest monthly increases since the recession ended in mid-2009. This hiring slowdown was broad-based across industries. Job creation is slowing in the United States, right? The economy needs job creation, right? Because there are people entering the workforce all the time. And there has been a slowdown in job creation. And let me add that those 75,000 jobs that were created, not all of them were full-time jobs. You can bet that a lot of them were not full-time positions. That unemployment is low, but let's remember that there's a lot of those folks who are not unemployed. They have a job, but it is not a full-time job. Furthermore, there are a lot of folks who have a job that is part-time, and another job that is part-time, and another job that is part-time, right? And that's growing. Those good-paying industrial jobs that were the basis of the U.S. economy, they ain't there anymore. And wages, as this article goes on to mention, haven't really significantly increased. So unemployment is low, meaning people have a job. It may not be a full-time job. However, job creation is suddenly the lowest it's been since 2009. Plus, wages not really going up very much. What's going on here? All right, Trump said in his State of the Union address that we were in the middle of an economic miracle. That's what he said, that we are living in the middle of an economic miracle. The fact that he said that should fill people with outrage. I'm sorry. I'm here in New York City, right? Today I was riding the subway train, and I had to wait for 20 minutes for a train to arrive, right? I waited, stood there and waited as there were extensive delays in the middle of the day on a Saturday. Very little congestion. I'm sitting there waiting in New York City, in the capital of capitalism. We've got an MTA, a transit system that's crumbling, but this is an economic miracle. If you go to different parts of this country, you go to Alabama, you go to Vermont, you go to Minnesota, there are municipalities that are unpaving their roads. They are pulling up the asphalt. They are taking asphalt with this device, this machine that you can rent called a reclaimer, and they are pulling up the asphalt, pulverizing it, and redistributing it. And where you used to have a paved road, you now have a dirt road. But we're in an economic miracle, right? We have the highest rate of household debt that we've ever had. Huge rate of household debt, rising and rising and rising. And I might add, what's coming? The student debt crisis. Millions of young people in the United States are in huge amounts of debt. Huge amounts of debt. Because they went and got an education. Something that's free in most countries in the world. Right? But we're in an economic miracle. Remember, it's an economic miracle, folks. This is an economic miracle. As our streets are falling apart, as our water treatment facilities are crumbling, as our public transportation systems are in ruin, as the wages and living standards are going down, as the younger generation is facing a lifelong sentence of short-term, low-wage service sector jobs, we're in the middle of an economic miracle. While debt is rising through the roof, we're in the middle of an economic miracle. Why does Trump say we're in the middle of an economic miracle? And he does have a fair basis for saying that. Why? The stock market is doing phenomenal. Now, there was a shake a couple months back. There's been some shake. It's been some turbulence since this China tariff, but the stock market's doing great. But if you learned anything from the 2008-2009 financial crisis, it should have been this. That when the stock market is going like this, and doing very well, but average Americans are stagnating. When Wall Street is going through the roof, but the standard of living is not going up. When you have things like jobless recoveries, When that kind of thing is happening, what you're experiencing is not real economic growth. That's called debt-based economic growth. And that's what we've got right now, right? Highest rate of debt ever, people running up their credit cards, right? We've got, Trump rolling back and rolling back a lot of the regulations from the Obama years. We've got fictitious capital, as Pasta is saying. We've got false credit. We've got basically fictional growth. This is not real economic growth. I mean, the amount of money in this economy that is being generated falsely and fictitiously is amazing. Derivatives, Wall Street schemes. I mean, all kinds of wealth generation that's not actually building or creating anything. This is all leading us down the same path we were led on in the lead up to the 2008-2009 financial crisis, when Alan Greenspan was there, legalizing all kinds of credit card and housing and mortgage lending, and then pretty soon the housing bubble burst, and then pretty soon the economy crashed, right? And what was going on? Well, the reality was your average American couldn't afford to buy a house the way they once did, right? And the housing market is big. Right? That's realtors, first of all, they're selling them, right? But construction, steel, cement, everything that goes into the housing market was down. And Americans just weren't buying houses. So Alan Greenspan, sitting in the Federal Reserve, said, we got to keep people buying houses. What do we do? What do we do? How do we get people to keep buying houses? And so he legalized all kinds of mortgage lending so that people who previously wouldn't have been able to buy houses could keep buying them. Why? He needed people to keep buying houses so, the housing bubble didn't burst. But pretty soon, that only worked for a little while, and I was in Detroit in the middle of this, and it was unbelievable. You'd get families, they would get a loan to buy a house, and they'd be living in their house, they'd been there for 2-3 years, all of a sudden their mortgage payment, triples after 3 years. Of course they lose their home. Could you imagine if you'd been paying a certain amount to live, and then all of a sudden it tripled, right? Your rent triples, right? Your mortgage triples one day, you're going to lose your home. There's no question about it. All over the United States, the housing bubble burst because Americans just couldn't afford it. The standard of living was going down. The good-paying industrial jobs were gone, right? Americans can't afford it. That's what's underlying all of this, is the fact that the American working class cannot afford. The American working class doesn't have the spending power that it once had, right? In order to keep our economy going, not only do you need workers selling their labor power, but you also need them buying back the products that they produce, right? And there you go. That's what happened. It's happening. It's happening again. And the student debt thing, someone pointed out to me very correctly. The student debt crisis, it's basically paving the way for another housing crisis. Why? Okay, so you've got thousands and thousands of young people. Actually, you've got millions of young people with huge amounts of student debt, right? So do you think that any bank, if you owe $10,000 in student debt, and you go to the bank and you say, all right, I want a mortgage loan to buy a house, what is the bank going to say? Do you think they're going to loan people money to buy a home? And maybe there'll be a few that will get it. Are they going to get a very good loan? I don't think so, right? The student debt crisis is basically paving the way for another housing crisis. If people are going to keep buying houses, they're not going to keep buying them. They are not going to keep buying houses. They are not going to keep buying houses if they've got huge amounts of student debt. This is a big crisis. Now, one thing I noticed, and this is interesting, is all across the United States, in places like Kansas, Ohio, Missouri, in middle America, we're seeing a rising trend of banks that have foreclosed houses not selling them to private owners anymore, but rather renting them out. And a lot of middle America, that used to be the staple of middle America, right? They own their own home. Well, now a lot of middle America, they have their home, which they rent from a bank, right? All throughout these small towns and all of that, where people's homes have been foreclosed, 2008, 2009, 2010, foreclosed homes everywhere you went, boarded up windows. Well, they've been sold, but they haven't been sold to private consumers. They've been sold to banks. And so the American dream of owning your own little piece of property has been eroded. And so now we have middle Americans living in houses they rent from a bank, right? It's interesting. There was a book that was published, maybe a decade ago, and it was a history of lawn care in the United States. But it was a kind of Marxist history of lawn care. And I went to the event where the author was speaking totally on a whim. I had no idea what I was going to. And he was talking about how lawn care was an expression of middle-class alienation, right? And it was fascinating to listen to. He was talking about basically the sociology of the American lawn. And I don't remember the name of the book, but I listened to this lecture by this academic, and he was talking about how after the Second World War, it suddenly became trendy. Americans, because of HUD and because of the Roosevelt administration's programs and all of that, and the post-war economic boom, all of a sudden millions of Americans were getting loans to buy homes, and we all know about redlining, where blatant discrimination. Black people didn't get the loans, white people did. They drew a red line on the map, and if you lived here, you got a loan. If you didn't live here, you didn't get one, right? I mean, it was blatant racism. But, millions of white middle-class Americans suddenly had their own homes. And all of a sudden, they had lawns. And they were mowing their lawns, right, to compete. And it was like, my lawn is perfect, right? And if somebody on the block didn't mow their lawn right, then they were thought to be a ne'er-do-well. And they were looked at with suspicion. And you have community associations passing regulations about what you can and cannot do on your lawn. Right? It's particularly intense stuff. But it was an expression, and it was almost, an incarnation of what Lenin writes about in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, with the labor aristocracy, right? Because these people that were buying their homes and mowing their lawns were workers. Factory workers, steel workers, meat packers, auto workers. They were working class people. But suddenly they didn't rent, they owned their home. And their home was their property. So they had a piece of property of their own, right? The urban proletariat, in the 1920s and 30s and 10s before that, the urban proletariat were all renting, right? And, the slum landlords and all that. You can read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. I mean, the urban proletariat, the people who immigrated to this country in the early parts of the 20th century, we're talking, Eastern Europeans, Irish, Italian, those folks who came over in the early parts of the 20th century, the urban industrial working class in Pittsburgh and New York City and Chicago and Cleveland and Minneapolis, the urban industrial working class. The urban industrial working class, they rented, they were ripped off by their landlords, they sold their labor on the factory floor, and ultimately communism, the biggest effort and the biggest achievement of the Communist Party of the United States was organizing them all into unions, right? And that was a generation-long struggle. Before World War I, William Z. Foster, himself the child of Irish immigrants, was working to try and get justice for these people, right? And William Z. Foster, his first big effort was with meat packers, the packing houses in Chicago. And he worked, inside the AFL-CIO. He worked, even though he was at that point like an anarcho-syndicalist. He hadn't fully come to communism yet. He was a militant labor organizer, but he was organizing these Eastern European and Irish Catholic like himself and Italian people that were just being worked to death in the urban slums, as meat packers. But, the urban proletariat, they rented, right? And they lived in urban centers and slums, and they were treated very badly. Right? But then, after the Second World War, suddenly this industrial working class of the United States, this urban proletariat, the white ones, are able to get a loan from the government, or a loan is arranged for them to get their own little piece of property. And they have a house, and that's the suburbs, like the origin of the suburbs, but not even the suburbs. The west side of Cleveland, right? They have a house, and they own it, and they have a lawn, and it's theirs, right? And that has an impact on their psychology, right? And if you listen to the post-war propaganda, right, the post-World War II anti-communist propaganda, you listen to it, it's all about communists want to get rid of property. The communists want to take your house. The communists want to take your car. Communists represent people without property. You have property. So because you have a house, you have more in common with the Wall Street guys than with, the African American community that never got the luxury of getting those loans to get their house. You have more in common with your boss and the owner of your steel mill than you do with people in the developing world who are starving and suffering, right? It was a way of eroding people's consciousness, right? That the creation of an industrial middle class that had a piece of property that affected their mindset, and that was part of dividing the working class in the United States, right? It's fascinating stuff, fascinating history. But I remember hearing this lecture from this fellow who'd written a book on lawn care and how it was kind of an expression of middle-class alienation. And this kind of obsession with lawn care that you see in a lot of suburban communities in the United States, is very much, it fits very closely with the gun obsession, right? You have your little piece of property, and then you need a gun to protect yourself from those who would take your property away, right? It's that kind of mindset, and that kind of, that labor aristocracy boom that we saw post-war, that really defined the United States, and ultimately that's why the 1960s generation, the politics that came out of it were not class struggle politics. It was middle class alienation, it was anti-racist struggles, but the notion of the working class fighting back for itself, class for itself, those notions, they were very absent during the 1960s. Because at that point you had this huge, cushy, industrial middle class in the United States, this huge labor aristocracy that wasn't interested in class struggle and had little pieces of property and identified with the bosses. And I think that that's important to remember. And what we're seeing now is the demolition of that labor aristocracy. That middle class is being phased out. The 2008-2009 financial crisis was big. What's happening to the younger generation, the millennial meltdown, the way that they're treating younger people in the United States, that's also a big part of it. But we're seeing the controlled demolition of the middle class of the United States, right? The post-World War II economic boom, that prosperous middle class that they allowed to exist coming out of the Second World War is being eroded. They're getting rid of it. They don't need it any longer to produce it, right? They've eliminated their jobs, not just with offshoring, but with technology mainly. They've eliminated their jobs. They don't need them. They simply don't need them. Shout out to Jenny Lynn, who's joining us. And that's what we're seeing. And this hiring slowdown, right? And they say it's partly impacted by the tariff threats against China, but there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. Shout out to Fresh as Flowers. Shout out to Old Gringo. So much we can talk about. But I also wanted to mention, because I know you all have heard this from me before. It just needs to be said. So, we know what's going on now. Trump has threatened a rising tariff on Mexico. It'll go up 5% every month, up to 25% in October, unless that Mexico gets control of the immigration issue, right? Unless they start cracking down on migrants, Trump is going to keep imposing this tariff on Mexico. So the Wall Street Journal, this is a right-wing paper. This is the Murdoch Press. Rupert Murdoch is now currently the owner, is describing Mexico right now, right? And let me prefix this by saying that if you believe in free market ideology, if you believe in Milton Friedman, right? If you believe in the philosophy of Friedrich von Hayek and Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan, Mexico should be a paradise, right? Mexico, has free trade. It's opened its doors with NAFTA to free trade, global free trade. And for a long time, Mexico had a state-run oil company, but it wasn't really state-run. It was just kind of a middleman for Wall Street oil companies. But the government bureaucracy kind of, was a middleman there. There was some government bureaucracy. It wasn't like Venezuela where all the oil profits were going into the state budget. There was a middleman for Wall Street corporations. Well, they got rid of it, right? They had another free market reform 3-4 years ago. Mexico privatized its oil. Mexico is about as free market as you can get. It is integrated into the global economy. I'm hoping that AMLO, the president, will move away from that, the new president, but as of yet, Mexico is free market. It's doing business with Wall Street and London. It used to grow its own food. Thanks to NAFTA, it's now dependent on American agribusiness. It is an unregulated free market system, right? And they privatized their oil. They've drastically reduced the role of the state, and it's capitalism. So according to these people, according to them, right, then, it should be a paradise, right? We all know, according to Milton Friedman, according to all this free market theory, right, socialism makes people poor and starving, but if you privatize everything and get the government off our backs and deregulate everything, everyone becomes wealthy and it leads to prosperity. So I wanted to read you, this is what conditions have been like in Mexico lately. You can hear gunshots while you dress your children for school, said Alida Nava, who fled from Guerrero State with her 3 children. Kids are afraid to go out on their own, and their only aspiration is to join a gang, says Miss Nava, at a shelter in Tijuana. 11,000 Mexicans requested asylum in the U.S. in the fiscal year of 2018. The murder rate in Mexico hit a record high last year at 27 per 100,000 people, compared with about 5 per 100,000 people in the United States. The murder rate in Mexico is well beyond 5 times the murder rate of the United States. Right? Drug chaos, poverty, suffering. That's what the free market has brought to Mexico, right? And you go south from Mexico, go to Honduras. 2009, Honduras had a socialist president. He was ousted. The socialist president was out of there, right? And lo and behold, Honduras has been having free market, deregulation reforms, and it's a mess. Guatemala, right? The United States has poured millions of dollars into Guatemala, back to the brutal dictator Rios Montt. Ronald Reagan went to Guatemala and shook hands with Rios Montt. The brutal dictator Rios Montt killed, the rebels, and Guatemala is a free market capitalist country. El Salvador, right now they've got a far right-wing government in El Salvador that has taken power, right? Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. These are the countries people are fleeing to the United States from. Every day, they find dead bodies on the U.S. border of people trying to get away from these countries. Honduras since 2009, I just read you Mexico's murder rate. The Honduran murder rate was one of the highest in the entire world. I believe only Haiti had a higher murder rate than Honduras did. And then Haiti, there's another example. All over the world, we see countries where capitalism has just, these are free market countries. They're doing what the IMF and the World Bank says. And they're impoverished, right? Argentina. Now, let's talk about Argentina. The media is not talking about this. Right? For a long time in Argentina, they had a populist leader, a social democrat, Cristina Kirchner. Well, she's out of office now. They've got Macri, a right-wing, pro-free market, pro-Wall Street fellow who's running Argentina. And what's happened in Argentina? They signed up with the IMF. Their currency has crashed. Argentina is wrecked. Argentina is a mess. They're doing what Ben Shapiro wants to do to the United States. They are doing what all the Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand textbooks say to do. They're doing it, right? They privatized things, signed on with the IMF, got IMF loans, deregulation, and it's wrecked Argentina. It's a mess. It's a disaster. And no one goes, oh, well, capitalism. No, right? Brazil. I was in Brazil in 2016. I was there at the time that Dilma Rousseff, the social democratic president, was being forced out of office. She was replaced with Michel Temer, who began privatizing things. And he was wildly unpopular, and things got worse and worse and worse. And now, Brazil, they've got Bolsonaro, and things in Brazil are getting even worse and worse and worse. Conditions have deteriorated. But again, no one says, oh, look, things were better in Brazil. But then, look what the free market policies does. Nobody says that. Meanwhile, what country had the highest rate of GDP growth in 2018 in South America? What country was it? Bolivia. The socialist president, the president who calls himself a Marxist-Leninist, Evo Morales oversaw the highest rate of economic growth. He's been building infrastructure. He's wiped out illiteracy in the country. He's nationalized the natural gas. He's nationalized the oil and the mining. He is a socialist in the tradition of Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, and the conditions in Bolivia are going up, right? The highest rate of GDP growth. But does anyone say anything? Nope, they just say, look, Venezuela's having problems. That answers everything. People are starving and suffering in Mexico. People are starving and suffering in Guatemala. People are starving and suffering in El Salvador. People are starving and suffering in Haiti. People are starving and suffering in Argentina. People are starving and suffering. Economic conditions are getting worse in Brazil. All over the world, we see these policies being implemented and wrecking countries and wrecking economies. But it's never because of capitalism, right? Well, that's not real capitalism. Or actually, it's because of the other thing, that it's this other thing. It's never because of capitalism. But yet, Venezuela has had problems since 2014. Their economy was doing pretty well. In fact, the Wall Street Journal admitted the party was still on up until 2013. But, Venezuela, all their problems are caused by socialism. Meanwhile, all throughout the world, we're seeing the fallout, the disaster, the utter disaster of what has happened, with deregulation and free markets, right? Argentina, they signed on with the IMF, and like that, overnight, their economy wrecked. I mean, Macri has just overseen, complete and utter collapse. I mean, this is ridiculous. No one wants to connect the dots, right? If a socialist country has difficulties, the media immediately connects the dots. Aha, socialism did it. But all over the world, country after country, the fall of the Soviet Union. What happened after the fall of the Soviet Union? Folks, look at the results of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? According to what Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek and Ayn Rand and everyone on American television says, after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the people in Eastern Europe should have just gotten rich, right? Because free markets lead to prosperity. Well, the fall of the Soviet Union was an absolute economic disaster. They imposed free market policies. Jeffrey Sachs, the psychopath from Columbia University, was there overseeing it. George Soros, they went in there and they gutted and deregulated like crazy. And it was an economic disaster in Russia. It was an economic disaster in Lithuania and Moldova and Yugoslavia. Everywhere they were doing this, it was a disaster. But no one says, oh, look, it's because of No, it's not because of capitalism. It's weird. Things were far better. Poll after poll after poll after poll. In the former Soviet Union, people say life was better. Under socialism, the economic results of the collapse of the Soviet Union were a catastrophe, but no one thinks that what happened in the 1990s all across Eastern Europe as these countries joined the global capitalist system, as they signed on with the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, nobody identifies that with capitalism. It's bizarre, right? If bad things happen in socialist countries, it's because of socialism. If bad things happen under capitalism, well, it's weird. It's very, 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 very weird. And it's like people just have blinders on. They can't bring themselves to see it. This experiment in neoliberalism is one of the greatest disasters we have seen in the history of humanity. Country after country after country gets wrecked by this stuff, and yet people drink the Kool-Aid. They keep believing this. They keep believing that the underlying premise behind neoliberal economics is this: you can cut your way into economic growth. That's what they believe. Cutting creates growth. And that, I've got to tell you, anybody who knows anything about economics knows that you cannot cut your way into economic growth. Right? Cut food stamps. What happens? Well, all the people that would have bought food with those food stamps don't buy it. And so then the agricultural companies lose money. Where's the growth? Right? Cut the jobs of government workers. And what happens? All these people with good, stable, secure jobs no longer have it. So their ability to spend money goes down. So you don't have economic growth. Cutting does not lead to economic growth. It just doesn't work that way. And that should be kind of common sense, right? If you have $20 in your pocket and then it gets cut down to $10, that does not mean growth, right? But that's what these libertarians believe. And they'll tell you, they do this song and dance. Well, if you cut the government spending, then all these people have more money because they don't pay taxes, and then they can go use that money to start their own business, and it's a tap dance. And sometimes it's very convincing. I mean, these guys, smoke and mirrors, bells and whistles, the fancy suits and the slideshow presentations, and they've got it all worked out. If you just cut government spending like crazy, everything will be fine. It's going to be great, and the people paying me will have more money, and it'll be. But it's a show. It's smoke and mirrors, and we've seen it over and over and over again. We saw it all throughout South and Central America in the 1980s and 90s. We saw country after country be wrecked, and that's why the Bolivarian Revolution happened. It was in response to that. After the fall of the Soviet Union, we saw it in Eastern Europe. They went in there and they said, oh, we're going to cut the government. We're going to break apart the government-run industries. We're going to dismantle socialism. Everyone's going to get rich. And it was a disaster, and it led to the rise of Vladimir Putin. Putin came in there and fixed their economy by creating two mega corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft. And now the Russian economy is largely centered around the selling of state-run oil and gas. Now, someone's asking me about modern monetary theory, and I have to tell you I'm not qualified to talk about that. I'm going to look into it, but I'm not qualified to give you an answer. I apologize for that, but I'm curious to learn about it. I know a lot of good people are promoting it, so I'm curious about it, but I'm not qualified to give you an answer, old gringo. I apologize. But we've seen this experiment play out over and over and over again, and it's been an epic, epic, epic disaster. And it's weird. Nobody points this out. No one says, oh, it's been a disaster. But there you go. Now, folks asked me to talk about Russia-China relations, right? And, when you look at that picture of President Putin and President Xi together, when you think about what's going on with Huawei and how the U.S. government has declared war basically on the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, going as far as to grab their chief financial officer in an airport in Canada. You look at what's being done to Russia, where they're basically trying to sabotage and demand that they not, have this oil pipeline and sell natural gas to Germany. You look at all of this. You need to understand something. And this is a big part of my upcoming book, which it's going to be, my upcoming book is coming up, and this is a big part of it. Okay, let's back up. Now, those of you who are familiar with Marxism know that for the majority of human history, for the majority of the existence of human beings, we were hunter-gatherers, right? That civilization, as we know it, is rather new in terms of human history, right? For the majority of our existence as a species, we were hunter-gatherers. And when we hunted and gathered, what did we do? Well, we hunted animals, and we gathered fruits and nuts, and shrubs, and that's how we lived. We lived by hunting and gathering, tribes of like 30 people, 20 to 30 people, going around hunting and gathering. That was our existence for most of human history. But the dawn of civilization came mainly because we got to be too good at hunting and gathering. Right? We developed spears so we could kill those animals more effectively. We studied the patterns in how crops grow, in how, vegetation is created, vegetation grows. We got too good at hunting and gathering. So there was a scarcity because we got too good at what we were doing. So the only way that the human race could continue, because we were too good at hunting and gathering, was to use our creativity. And so we started growing crops, and we started domesticating animals. And that represented a shift, right? We weren't hunting and gathering anymore. We weren't taking what was already there. At the point in which we domesticated animals, at the point at which we started growing crops, we weren't taking what was already there. We were creating. We had an economy for the first time that was about what we ourselves created. We enabled those animals to breed. We planted those seeds and grew those crops. We created. And we stopped hunting and gathering at that point. We started building. Houses, huts to live in, right? We started having villages. We started having cities. Right? We transitioned from living off the environment toward making the environment serve us, and we moved from being hunters and wreckers and vandals to being city builders. It was a transition. And it comes from the fact that in our DNA, and on some level as human beings, we have a creative capacity that other species just don't have. Right? No species can do what we do. We are the only species, as Frederick Engels put it, that has the ability to make nature serve us. Every other species interacts with nature on some level, but we have the ability to make nature serve us. And that distinguishes us from animals. But within us, we still have that hunter-gatherer mentality. But we also have that city-building tendency. And if you look at the human species, that divide between the city builder and the vandal, that divide has always been there. And as human civilizations have developed, you'll notice that there are two distinct types of civilizations. And this is, I'm getting back to Xi and Putin, okay? Right? I've talked a lot about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was very much a civilization based on the hunter-gatherer mindset. They went around the world with their spears and swords and found peoples and nations and forced them to pay tribute. Right? That's what they did. That was how the Roman Empire existed. And the tribute often came in the form of human chattel slaves. Right? And they had a highly inefficient system of production. But they went around the world, they found people, they enslaved them, they forced them to give them tools, they forced them to give them crops. And, they were very bad at producing their own tools. They were very bad at producing their own crops, but that was okay because they controlled the trade routes. Right? They were hunting and gathering, going all across the world, finding things that were already there and violently seizing them. That was the Roman Empire. And that was the Vikings, right? We know about, eventually the Roman Empire just ultimately, after about, a few hundred years, it wasn't really sustainable any longer. And part of what brought it down was the forces, the Germanic tribes, they call the barbarians, who were basically doing the same thing, right? They were going around robbing and raiding people and stealing what was already there. And eventually, you have the Germanic tribes in the oceans, the Vikings. And also, when we talk about Germanic tribes, let's talk about the origins of Britain, right? What is the moment that is definitive in the history of Britain? It's the Battle of Hastings, when the Normans, a Germanic tribe based in Gaul in France, invaded Britain and took over, right? The Norman invasion, right? When, I believe it was, and that was the basis. And in fact, every British monarch can trace their lineage, their family history, back to the Battle of Hastings. That was the origin of the British monarchy. The British monarchy was very much, you talk about William the Conqueror, that was very much this hunter-gatherer instinct. And if you look at what the British Empire became, right? It was very much that same vandal mentality. And it's funny. There's a song that's actually the theme of the British Navy. What is it? We'll always be ready. Steady, boys, steady. We'll fight and we'll conquer again and again. Right? That's the heart of oak. Heart of oak are our ships. Heart of oak are our men. We'll always be ready. Steady, boys, steady. We'll fight and we'll conquer again and again. Right? The British Empire went to India, where they had the oldest textile industry in the world. Went to Bangladesh, where they had Sonar Bengal, the golden Bangladesh, where, I mean, the cloth that they were weaving, the silk, I mean, it was amazing stuff. What did they do? They burned it down, and they forced them to import from Britain, right? I mean, you go to all these places, right? I mean, why was it? I mean, there's always talk about Gandhi, right? Well, what was Gandhi doing? What was the main thing? One of his main acts was he started boiling seawater to have his own salt. Why? Because the British went to India and made a law that they had to buy their salt from British corporations. And Gandhi was making his own salt. And so, of course, he was arrested, right? And that was his civil disobedience, was making his own salt. The British Empire was based on controlling the sea routes. It was Vandal mindset. It was about controlling the trade routes. There are civilizations that emerge throughout global history that are based on controlling the trade routes, holding back economic development, and having a monopoly on trade and holding back economic development and beating down economic development that does exist and mooching off of economic development that exists. You can talk about the British Empire. You can talk about, the barbarians and the Vikings. You can talk about, the Roman Empire. These are hunter-gatherer. These are vandals, right? This is one distinct form of civilization. And nowadays, and it's interesting, because the forces that support NATO, the coalition called NATO, have often described themselves as Atlanticists. They say, if you're a supporter of NATO, according to people who use all the geopolitical terminology, you're an Atlanticist. An Atlanticist. Well, the Atlanticist mentality, or I should say, the Atlanticist pathology, is a Vandal mindset. It is this distinct aspect of human beings. It is us reducing ourselves. It is human civilizations that revert back to hunter-gatherer type behavior. Not building, not constructing, not helping advance, but rather controlling trade routes. It is an economic model in which countries become wealthy and empires are built not by engaging in historical progress, not by promoting science, not by raising living standards, but by a small group of rulers using brute military force to control trade routes. And that hunter-gatherer Vandal mindset, that is what Lenin describes in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Right? As bad as Andrew Carnegie was, as bad as Henry Morgan was, as bad as the industrial capitalists of the United States were, the industrial capitalists still believed in historical progress. Right? Andrew Carnegie, he sponsored a lot of libraries. And he was vicious to the working class. I'm not defending his anti-labor activities. He was a vicious, ruthless employer. Same with Henry Ford. Same with all of them, right? They were vicious in defending their own profits. But they still believed in historical progress. They still believed that by being captains of industry, I believe that term can be traced back to Stalin, captains of industry, they were advancing human progress. But Lenin, in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, describes a completely different breed of capitalist. How the captains of industry, as they were called, were being replaced with financiers, bankers, right? How these international cartels and trusts were arising, where finance houses were becoming superior and dominating over industrial capital, right? And as capitalism moved into its monopoly stage of imperialism, you had capitalists who no longer saw their successes as coming alongside successes for all of humanity. That was the change, right? And it was this Vandal mindset reasserting itself. But anyhow, folks, what I'm basically trying to say here is that the rise of Russia and China is an alternative economic model. It is an economic model not based on controlling trade routes, but on advancing human progress. Russia and China have become global superpowers by unleashing human creativity, by raising living standards, and helping their populations to rise out of poverty. And that is a distinct difference. And if you look throughout human history, you can divide the rise of civilizations between civilizations that advance through controlling trade routes and holding back human progress, and civilizations that advance by making their people smarter and giving their people a better life. You can do that. There's a big distinction. City builders and vandals, right? And that when we see Russia and China getting closer together, what that is ultimately is a repudiation of Atlanticism. It is a repudiation of Atlanticism, and it is the city builder mindset reasserting itself. That's basically what's happening. That's what's happening. And when you look at President Xi and you look at President Putin, when you listen, as I have, I've been to the World Festival of Youth and Students, I've been to the Yalta Economic Forum in Crimea, I've been to a lot of these meetings that are taking place, and I listen to these various forces that represent various governments around the world, that also represent various corporations arising in Eurasia right now. They have a relationship with human history and human progress that is positive. They want human civilization to advance. They have not succumbed to the Atlanticist pathology. And that's what you need to understand. This divide in the world right now, with the rise of Eurasia and the decline of the Western European and the United States, this is rooted in a clash between the Atlanticist, hunter-gatherer, predatory mentality and the notion that history should advance and that the duty of a nation-state or of a government is to make a better life and to serve the people. And that's the clash that's happening. Do we have states that serve their people and try to raise living standards and control their economies, or do we have governments that allow small groups of people to get rich by controlling the trade routes? And if you look at everything going on in our economy with, student debt, the prison industrial complex, it's there. Accumulation through destruction seems to define the U.S. economy, whereas Eurasia is pulling itself up by its bootstraps. And that is the division in our world today. And that is what is behind geopolitics. And on that note, folks, I'm going to wrap it up. It's been a fun evening. I love you all. Best wishes.